You've got to be kidding me." The words came out harsh, dripping with the kind of cockiness only a 20-year-old with stripes on his sleeve could muster. Sergeant Marcus Reed stood with his hands on his hips, staring down at the rifle like it was a personal insult. "Old man, that thing doesn't belong on a military range." Frank Dawson, 84 years old, didn't acknowledge the comment. His eyes stayed locked on the wavering heat lines that danced across the Mojave sand, making the targets in the distance shimmer like mirages. He remained seated on a weathered camp stool, still as stone, hands resting on his knees. The rifle that had drawn the sergeant's ire was unlike anything else on the range that morning. Its custom frame and stock were painted in bright high-visibility orange, the kind of color you'd see on safety equipment or children's playground toys. Among the tactical blacks and desert camos of the serious long-range rifles around it, Frank's weapon looked absurd. A lance corporal, baby-faced with a sunburned nose, let out a laugh. "Yo, Sarge, you think he's gonna shoot Nerf darts with that thing?" The handful of young Marines gathered around found that hilarious. They were the new generation, raised on precision optics and ballistic computers, digital rangefinders and smartphone apps that calculated wind drift. To them, this old man and his ridiculous orange rifle were relics, amusing distractions before their real training began. Reed took a step forward. His shadow fell across Frank's shooting bench. "I'm gonna need you to pack up your gear, sir. This is a restricted range for active personnel. We're running advanced marksman qualifications today." He pointed at the orange rifle again. "That thing is a liability, and frankly, it's embarrassing. You want to play with your toys? There's a public range 40 miles south." His tone was the voice of someone who believed he had all the authority in the world. Frank Dawson remained silent. His weathered hands didn't move. His face didn't change expression. That stillness seemed to irritate the sergeant more than any argument could have. It was unnatural, a well of patience so deep it felt like a rebuke. The shooting range, a sprawling expanse of graded dirt carved out of the desert floor, was normally a place of controlled chaos. Rifle reports, shouted commands, the smell of gun oil and spent breath. But in this small pocket of confrontation, an uncomfortable quiet had settled. Shooters at nearby benches had paused their preparations. Conversations died mid-sentence. Everyone was watching. Sergeant Reed, sensing the audience and misreading the old man's silence as stubborn defiance, raised his voice. "Did you hear me, old-timer? I said pack it up. What are you even doing here? This isn't the local VFW on bingo night." He leaned close, dropped his voice to a stage whisper that carried to everyone within earshot. "You probably wandered onto base by accident. Got confused. Maybe we should call someone to come get you." Frank finally moved, slow, deliberate. He reached into his canvas range bag, the Marine's tent expecting compliance. Instead, he pulled out a worn leather bifold wallet, opened it, extracted a laminated ID card, held it out without a word. Reed snatched it, glanced at it, did a double take. "This has to be fake, or expired." He turned it over, repeated, like the plastic might reveal some hidden flaw. The credentials to his visible frustration were legitimate. Current, unrestricted base access. Name Dawson, Frank L. He shoved the card back. "Fine, you've got clearance," Reed admitted, voice tight with irritation. "But that doesn't mean you can play games here. We've got a 3,500-meter target set up. $1 million equipment. I'm not risking our data, because of whatever that is." He gestured dismissively at the orange rifle. "We're pushing the boundaries of modern shooting here. Last thing we need is some stray round from your garage project screwing up our sensors." The lance corporal, emboldened, reached out, tapped the rifle's stock with his index finger. "Feels like cheap plastic, Sarge. Bet he 3D printed it off the internet." The moment the young Marine's finger touched the rifle, something shifted in Frank Dawson's eyes. For just a fraction of a second, the calm exterior cracked. Something ancient and hard flickered behind his gaze. The desert sun vanished. In its place, the dim emergency lighting of a field hospital tent, the smell of antiseptic and blood, the distant thump of mortars walking closer. A voice from another time, young, strained. "They've zeroed in on us, Frank. You have to finish it. They'll see the orange from the air. It's the only way." The orange wasn't a joke. It was a signal flare, a beacon for extraction. One bright point of color in an endless sea of jungle green, so the helicopters could find them. Frank blinked. The memory retreated. The bright Mojave sun returned. The smirking faces of the young Marines came back into focus. He hadn't moved, hadn't said a word, but something had changed. The quiet dignity now had an edge, a weight. Across the range, standing near the observation tower, a man named Tom Fisher watched the confrontation unfold. He was a former Marine gunnery sergeant, now worked as a civilian range safety officer. Retirement job, decent pay, low stress. Usually, he'd seen his share of cocky young NCOs over the years. Swagger came with the uniform sometimes, but something about this situation felt different. It wasn't just disrespect, it was who they were disrespecting. The old man wasn't some weekend warrior, Fisher could tell. There was an economy of movement in how he sat, a discipline in his stillness that spoke volumes. And that rifle, strange as it looked, it had clean, purposeful line, custom work, professional grade, not a toy. Fisher's eyes narrowed. He'd seen a rifle like that before, long time ago, in a classified briefing. Something about a legend, a ghost from a war the history books glossed over. He glanced at the sign-in sheet clipped to his board, ran his finger down the list. Dawson, Frank L. The name triggered something in his memory. A half-forgotten story, whispered in NCO clubs after too many beers, about a man who could make impossible shots, who operated alone in places that didn't officially exist. They called him the Desert Phantom. A cold knot formed in Fisher's stomach. These kids had no idea. They weren't just hassling some random old guy. They were poking a legend with a stick. Fisher turned away from the scene, walked behind the tower where he had privacy, pulled out his cell phone. This was way above his pay grade. He scrolled through his contacts, found the number for the base operations duty officer. He hesitated for just a second. This could blow up in his face, overstepping his authority as a civilian contractor. He could get fired, but his gut told him this was bigger than his job. He pressed call. "Captain, this is Tom Fisher at the long-range facility," he said when the line connected. Voice low, urgent. "We've got a situation developing here. Some young Marines from 2nd Battalion are giving an old civilian a hard time. They're about to make a serious mistake. A discipline issue." The voice on the other end sounded bored. "That should go through their chain of command, Fisher." "Normally, yes, sir." Fisher, his patience wearing thin. "But the civilian's name is Frank Dawson, and they're mocking his rifle. The orange one." There was a pause on the line. Static. Fisher could almost hear the gears turning. "Dawson." The captain's tone had changed. Less bored, more alert. "Should I know that name?" "Run it up the chain, sir," Fisher insisted, his voice hardening. "Run it fast. Tell them it's about the orange rifle. They'll know what it means." He ended the call before the captain could ask more questions. He'd lit the fuse. Now all he could do was wait and hope the explosion didn't take everyone down with it. Inside the air-conditioned command center, Captain Riley stared at his phone. Tom Fisher wasn't the type to call in drama. The man was solid. Former gunny. If he said there was a problem, there was a problem. Riley opened his computer, pulled up the military personnel database, typed in the name, Dawson, Frank L. The system processed for a moment. Then a flag appeared. Bright red. Access restricted. Flag officer authorization required. Riley's stomach dropped. Flag officer. That meant a general. He was a captain. This was way above his head. He stood up, walked quickly to the office of the base commander. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes. He knocked once, entered without waiting for permission. "Sir, we have a situation at the long-range facility." Colonel Hayes, a man whose face looked like a topographic map of every desert deployment for the last 25 years, looked up from his paperwork, annoyed. "What is it, Captain?" "Civilian on the range. Name's Frank Dawson." System flagged him heavy. "Requires general officer clearance." Hayes's expression changed instantly. The annoyance vanished, replaced by something between alarm and disbelief. He came around his desk, looked at Riley's screen. When he saw the name, the color drained from his face. He didn't say anything, just picked up the red phone on his desk. The secure line, direct to the commanding general's office. "General, this is Colonel Hayes. I apologize for the interruption." He paused, listening. "Ma'am, we have Frank Dawson on our range right now. He's in a confrontation with some of our Marines." Another pause, longer this time. "Yes, ma'am. The Desert Phantom. They're trying to remove him from the facility." Hayes's face went from pale to grim. "Understood, ma'am. I'll meet you at your vehicle." He slammed the phone down, looked at Riley with eyes that could burn through steel. "Get me the commander of 2nd Battalion on the line right now. Tell him his career is hanging by a thread. Tell him General Klein is personally responding to his location, and God help his Marine." Back at the range, Sergeant Reed's patience had evaporated completely. The old man's silent refusal to move had become a personal affront. The crowd was growing. Other shooters were watching. He felt his authority, his identity as a Marine NCO, being challenged by an 80-year-old man with a ridiculous rifle. This had to end. Now. All right, that's it, Reed snapped, his voice cracking with frustration. I'm done being nice. You are obstructing a military training exercise. I'm ordering you to vacate this position immediately. He took a threatening step forward, reaching for Frank's shoulder. If you don't move, I'll have you detained for trespassing. Maybe you need a psych evaluation. You seem confused, old man. Maybe you forgot where you are. His hand was inches from Frank's shoulder when the sound started. Low at first. A rumble. A vibration felt through boot soles. It grew quickly. The deep roar of multiple high-performance engines pushed to their limits. Every head on the range turned. A massive dust cloud was rising from the access road. 3 black military SUVs and a lit Humvee. Not driving. Charging. They bypassed the parking area completely. Drove straight onto the range itself. Skidded to a halt just feet from the confrontation. Dust billowed. Doors flew open before the vehicles fully stopped. Figures emerged with military precision that made Reed's squad look like amateurs. Out of the lead SUV stepped Colonel Hayes, but it was the figure from the second vehicle that made every jaw drop. Major General Victoria Klein, 2 stars gleaming on her collar. A woman known throughout the Corps for an iron will and a combat record that was legendary. She stepped onto the dirt, her uniform immaculate. Her eyes swept the scene, taking in Reed's aggressive posture, the stunned faces of his Marine, and finally settling on the calm-seated figure of Frank Dawson. She ignored everyone else. Her stride was powerful, direct. She walked straight toward the old man. The entire range fell silent. The only sounds were her boots on gravel and the pinging of cooling engine. Sergeant Reed stood frozen, his hands still hovering where he'd meant to grab Frank, his mind unable to process what was happening. General Klein stopped directly in front of Frank Dawson. She didn't speak. Instead, she brought her heels together with a sharp crack. Her arms snapped up in the crispest, most respectful salute Reed had ever witnessed. It wasn't a routine salute. It was profound, reverent, the kind a warrior gives to a living legend. Mr. Dawson, she said, her voice clear and strong, carrying across the silent range. It is an honor, sir. I apologize for the conduct of my Marines. They don't know who you are. She held the salute, waiting. Frank Dawson slowly rose from his stool. Not as tall as he once was, but he stood straight, defying his years. He gave a slight nod. Only then did the general lower her salute. General Klein turned to face Sergeant Reed. The warmth in her eyes was gone, replaced by glacial fury. Sergeant, she began, her voice dangerously quiet. Do you have any idea who this man is? Reed, pale and trembling, could only stammer. No, ma'am. He's just a civilian, ma'am. A civilian? The general let out a short, humorless laugh. Sergeant, you are standing in the presence of a man who has accomplished things you cannot even comprehend. This is not just a civilian. This is Frank Dawson. She said the name like it was sacred. She paused, letting it sink in. Her gaze swept over the assembled crowd. For those of you too young or too ignorant to know, let me educate you. This man holds the Distinguished Service Medal, the highest civilian award for valor our nation can give. He was a special operations consultant for 35 years. Before that, he served in conflicts your textbooks don't mention. He is credited with 7 confirmed eliminations at ranges exceeding 2,800 meters, a record that stood unbroken for decades, all with rifles he designed and built himself. He is the reason our current sniper doctrine exists. He wrote the manual. We call him the Desert Phantom, not because he's dead, but because he would infiltrate areas deemed impossible, complete missions no one else would attempt, and extract without a trace. She gestured to the orange rifle. And this weapon you mocked, this toy. This is the Dawson Mark IV, the prototype that became the foundation for the M310 sniper system. You know why it's orange? During a covert operation, he spent 4 days behind enemy lines, protecting wounded operators, waiting for extraction. The jungle canopy was so thick, helicopters couldn't locate them. So he built this, from salvaged parts and raw aluminum, and he painted it high visibility orange, so rescue could spot it from the air. That color saved 6 lives, including a pilot who went on to command an entire Marine division. The silence was absolute now, thick with shame and awe. Sergeant Reed looked like he wanted to disappear. General Klein turned back to him, her voice dropping to a lethal growl. You didn't see a veteran. You saw an old man. You didn't see history. You saw a toy. You saw weakness where there was unimaginable strength. You have dishonored your uniform, your corps, and yourself. She pointed at him with a trembling finger. You and your entire squad will report to my office at 0600 tomorrow for a personal lesson in Marine Corps history and professional respect. A lesson you will never forget. As the general's words hung in the air, Frank Dawson finally spoke. His voice was not loud, but it carried a quiet authority that commanded attention even more than the general's anger. General, he said calmly, they're young, they're confident. That's not a bad thing. They just need to learn where to direct it. He turned his gaze to Sergeant Reed. There was no anger in his eyes, only a deep, patient wisdom. Your job isn't to be the strongest, it's to respect the strength that came before you, to learn from it. Humility is a heavier load than any pack you'll ever carry, but it's the one that will take you the farthest. He reached out and patted the stock of the orange rifle. As he did, another memory flashed, sharper this time. A makeshift workshop, somewhere hot and humid, the air thick with machine oil and fear. His hands, younger then, steady as he milled the receiver by hand. A wounded pilot lay on a cot nearby, feverish, bleeding through bandages. Why orange, Frank? The pilot had mumbled through the pain. Frank hadn't looked up from his work. Because I'm only planning on making one shot. After that I want to be easy to find, one way or another. It had been a calculated risk. Paint the rifle bright orange, make himself visible to rescue, but also visible to the enemy if he failed. The memory was a testament to a kind of courage these young Marines couldn't yet understand. The courage to build your own extraction beacon, knowing it might become your grave marker instead. Frank blinked. The memory faded. He was back on the range. Sergeant Reed stood before him, face pale, eyes wide, finally understanding the magnitude of his mistake. I'm sorry, sir, Reed managed to whisper. I didn't know. I'm sorry. Frank gave a small nod. Now you do. Learn from it. The fallout was immediate and severe. General Klein was true to her word. Sergeant Reed and his entire squad reported to her office at 0600 the next morning. They didn't just get a lecture, they got a complete re-education. For the next month, they were assigned to a special remedial program. Not physical punishment. Something worse. Mental punishment. They spent their days at the base historical archive, reading after-action reports from conflicts dating back 50 years. Studying citations for valor, learning the names and stories of men who'd sacrificed everything. They cleaned and cataloged artifacts in the military museum. Weapons, uniforms, letters from the front lines. Each item a piece of history they'd been ignorant of. Their evenings were spent writing essays on military ethics, reports on the meaning of respect, reflections on humility and leadership. They interviewed older veterans, listened to their stories, recorded oral histories for the archive. It was grueling, not physically, but mentally and emotionally. They were being humbled in a way that no amount of push-ups or forced marches could achieve. The story of the old man with the orange rifle spread through the base like wildfire. Within days, everyone knew. It became a cautionary tale, a reminder that heroes don't always look like you expect, that legends walk among us, quiet, unassuming, waiting to be recognized or ignored. An official base-wide directive was issued. All personnel, regardless of rank, were required to complete annual training on veteran interaction and respect protocol. The program was called Recognizing Quiet Valor. Frank Dawson's photograph was the first slide of every presentation, standing beside his orange rifle, a living reminder. 3 weeks after the incident, Sergeant Reed found himself in the base library. He was there voluntarily, off duty, researching. He'd been reading declassified operation reports, learning about conflicts he'd never heard of, wars fought in shadows, by men whose names were never in newspapers. The more he read, the more he understood how little he'd known, how much he'd taken for granted. The library door opened. Frank Dawson walked in. The old man moved with the same quiet purpose, heading for the technical section. Engineering manuals. Advanced mathematics. Reed's heart pounded. His hands went clammy. He stood up. His chair scraped loudly against the floor. He approached Frank, stopped a respectful distance away, stood at attention. "Mr. Dawson," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, I wanted to apologize. Properly. Face to face." Frank turned, looked at the young Marine, saw the genuine remorse in his eyes. "I was arrogant," Reed continued. "I was ignorant. I judged you without knowing anything about you. I disrespected you. Your service, your sacrifice. There's no excuse. I'm deeply sorry, sir." Frank studied him for a long moment, assessing. Then he offered a small smile. Forgiving. "You made a mistake, son. A big one. But you're learning from it. That's what matters." He gestured to the books Reed had been reading. "You're doing the work. That tells me who you really are." Not that moment on the range. Reed felt a weight lift from his shoulders. "Thank you." Frank nodded. "Humility looks good on you. Wear it well." The two men stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Not as sergeant and civilian, not as young and old, but as two people who understood each other. "Can I ask you something, sir?" Reed said hesitantly. "Go ahead." "The orange rifle. Why did you keep it that color? After the mission was over, you could have repainted it." Frank looked down at his hands. Weathered, scarred. "Because it reminds me," he said quietly. "Every time I see it, I remember why I'm here. I remember the men I brought home, the ones I couldn't. It's not about the color. It's about what it represents. Hope, sacrifice, purpose." He looked back at Reed. "You'll understand that someday. When you've been in long enough, you'll have your own reminders. Your own orange rifle. Whatever form it takes." Reed nodded slowly, beginning to understand. "Thank you, sir, for the lesson, for your patience, for everything." Frank smiled. "Just pass it on. When you're the old guy someday, and some young hotshot dismisses you, remember this feeling, and teach them better." "I will, sir. I promise." 1 week later, the range was closed for a special event. General Klein stood with Colonel Hayes and several senior officers. Sergeant Reed and his squad were there too, standing at a respectful distance, no longer smirking, subdued, attentive. Frank Dawson was at the firing line, lying prone behind his orange rifle. The general had requested a demonstration, wanted the young Marines to see what the rifle could really do, what Frank could really do. The target was set at 3,500 meters, just over 2 miles. It shimmered in the distance, barely visible, a speck on the horizon. There was no fanfare, no speeches, just Frank, the rifle, and the desert. He adjusted the scope with small, precise movements. His fingers moved with the confidence of decades of experience. He read the wind, not with instruments, with his eyes, his instincts, watching the heat waves, the dust patterns, the way the air moved. For a full minute, he was perfectly still, part of the landscape, barely breathing. Then the rifle cracked. A single sharp report, almost anticlimactic. The sound echoed across the desert, then faded. For several long seconds, nothing happened. The world held its breath. Then the screen next to the general lit up. A single green indicator. Dead center of the target. Perfect hit. 3,500 meters. A collective gasp went through the assembled crowd. It wasn't just an impressive shot. It was an impossible one. A shot that defied everything they thought they knew about physics, ballistics, human capability. The legend of the Desert Phantom wasn't just a story anymore. It was real. They'd just witnessed it. Sergeant Reed stared at the screen, then at Frank, then back at the screen. His mouth was open, his mind struggling to process what he'd seen. Frank calmly stood up, ejected the spent casing, set the rifle down gently on the bench. He turned to the general, gave a small nod. "Still works, ma'am." General Klein smiled, a rare, genuine smile. "Indeed it does, sir. Thank you for the demonstration." She turned to the assembled Marines, her voice carrying authority. "Remember this moment. Remember what you just saw. Not the shot itself, but the man who made it. The humility, the quiet competence, the decades of discipline it took to reach this level. This is what mastery looks like. This is what dedication looks like. This is what you should aspire to become." Reed and his squad stood straighter, not from fear, from respect. Real respect. They finally understood. 6 months after that day, on the range, change had taken root throughout the base. The Recognizing Quiet Valor program had become more than just a training requirement. It had become part of the culture. Marines began looking at older veterans differently, not as relics, but as resources, living libraries of knowledge and experience. Frank Dawson continued to visit the range twice a month, not for demonstrations, just to shoot, to maintain his skills, to remember. But now he was never alone. Young Marines would approach him, respectfully, asking questions, seeking advice, wanting to learn. He'd sit with them, share stories, teach them about windage, elevation, the mathematics of long-range shooting, but more importantly, the mental discipline, the patience, the respect for the craft. Sergeant Reed had transformed. The arrogance was gone, replaced by quiet confidence. He became one of the best instructors on base. He started a mentorship program, pairing young Marines with retired veterans, creating connections across generations. He credited Frank for everything, for showing him what true strength looked like, what real humility meant. One afternoon, Frank was packing up his gear at the range, the orange rifle carefully secured in its case. Reed approached, no longer hesitant, just respectful. "Mr. Dawson, I wanted to tell you something." Frank looked up. "What's that, son?" "I'm being promoted," made Staff Sergeant. "They're assigning me to instructor duty at the Scout Sniper School." Frank smiled. "That's outstanding. You've earned it." "I wouldn't have without you," Reed said. "Without that day, without the lesson, I was headed down the wrong path. You set me straight." Frank shook his head. "I didn't do anything. You did the work. You made the choice to learn, to change. That was all you." Reed extended his hand. Frank took it. A firm handshake. Mutual respect. "There's one more thing," Reed said. "At the school, we're implementing a new curriculum, a course on the history of military marksmanship, the evolution of sniper doctrine. The first lecture is going to be about you, about the men who came before us, who built the foundation we stand on. I was hoping you might come. Guest speaker. Tell your story, your way." Frank considered it, then nodded slowly. "I'll do it. But not for me, for the others, the ones who didn't make it home, so they're remembered." "Thank you, sir." As Reed walked away, Frank looked out across the desert range. The sun was setting, painting the sand in shades of orange and gold. He thought about the young Marines he'd met, the lessons shared, the connections made. His orange rifle wasn't just a tool anymore. It was a bridge, connecting past to present, experience to youth, history to future. Legends don't need monuments of stone and bronze. They just need to be remembered, to be passed on, one generation to the next. And as long as men like Reed continued to learn, to teach, to respect those who came before, the legacy would live on, not in awards or accolades, but in quiet moments on desert ranges, where old men with strange rifles teach young warriors what it truly means to serve.